Welcome to the Fantasy Addiction Network. Today we are talking Week 15 start sit choices for you guys for Week 15 in the wide receiver position. The ever important Week 15. You have to make your lineup decisions right if you want to make it to that fantasy championship. We're going to help you guys do that today. So again, I know this is a pretty busy season for a lot of people, and I just want to make sure I give the tips and advice right up front. We'll talk about it more as we go on. So the people I'm recommending starting this week, starting with number 5, is Deebo Samuel. Number 4, we have Darius Slayton. Number 3, Zach Pascal. Number 2, we have A.J. Brown. And then number 1, our start of the week, is Robert Woods. Players that I'm recommending you try to avoid this week are Stefon Diggs, Courtland Sutton, John Brown, Robby Anderson, and Tyler Boyd. All right. So let's get into our starts. We'll start with number 5, looking at Deebo Samuel versus Atlanta. Atlanta is number 12 in fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. They just lost Devontae Casey. It's not really much hope of Atlanta slowing San Francisco down at this point. The only thing that I think a lot of people are hoping for, at least from a fantasy angle, is that this turns into a shootout and not just a blowout. But either way, I think if San Francisco routs Atlanta, even if it's a blowout, I do think that Samuel is likely to contribute a lot of the production there. He's been incredibly consistent, honestly, ever since he broke out about 4 weeks ago. He's either scored a touchdown or had a decent amount of yards and targets each week to keep you going. And he's just like vying for a breakout week, similar to what we saw from Emmanuel Sanders last week. We know now that that offense is capable of supporting that kind of a blow-up play, and I think that Deebo Samuel is just waiting for his turn. I think this is a good week for him to likely blow up. So if you have Deebo Samuel, get him into your lineup. Okay, number 4, we have Darius Slayton versus Miami. I mean, this one's pretty easy. You don't have to dig too much into your analytics. Miami is number 2 on the season for fantasy points allowed to the wide receivers. They just allowed Robby Anderson to torch them, and they pretty much allowed every team that has a big play receiver to torch them. John Brown had a big game against them. Amari Cooper had a big game against them. Like, at this point, just if you have a big play receiver that's playing Miami, they have to be in your lineup because the ceiling is just so high. Yes, I recognize the floor is low with Eli Manning throwing the ball, but he looked pretty decent this last week, at least in the first half. And Miami's defense is not scary by any means. If you have Darius Slayton, you got to go with the stealing plays at this point, trying to have a super high scoring team to make sure that you get your team pushed forward into the Super Bowl. I think that Darius Slayton is a great play. Okay, Zach Pascal. Now this one, most people might not know this, but New Orleans is actually pretty bad when it comes to fantasy points allowed for the wide receivers. They are number 3 on the season in points allowed against the wide receivers. And overall, unless Pascal gets shadowed by Marshawn Lattimore, which I think at this point is pretty unlikely. Lattimore doesn't typically shadow receivers unless they are true alphas. I don't think that Pascal is a true alpha. Yes, they did just lose Paris Campbell, but he wasn't doing much at this point anyway. Marcus Johnson is coming on, looking to be more involved, and then Jack Doyle will definitely be part of this game. So I don't think that they will try to just game plan Zach Pascal out of the game. And I think Pascal has shown us over the past couple weeks that he can be pretty consistent, and he's been a reliable end zone target for Jacoby Brissett. I'm predicting this to be a higher scoring game than is expected, so I think Zach Pascal ends up being the beneficiary of that. Okay, number 2, A.J. Brown. We're just going to go right back into the flames on this one. We recommended him as a waiver wire pickup last week. If you started him along with our start of the week Ryan Tannehill, you had one of the best stacks that we've had in fantasy playoffs in quite some time. A.J. Brown and Ryan Tannehill combined together put up so many points. If you had both of them, it became very hard for anyone to beat you, and I'm just going right back to the well on this one. Yes, A.J. Brown has been pretty inconsistent all season long, but honestly, like, once you have a breakout game like you did last week, it's kind of hard to put that genie back in the bottle. And that also goes to say that Houston isn't very good against the wide receiver. They're number 14 all season long in fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver spot, but this game has one of the highest Vegas over-unders. It's the most likely to become a shootout The game is in Tennessee. So given the likelihood for a shootout in this game, given the high over-under, A.J. Brown is likely to have another big play in this game. I think that this could very, very easily turn into the highest scoring game on the week. I don't think the Texans are going to let the Titans run all over them. They're gonna want to rebound from last week after losing so badly to the Broncos, and the winner of this game ends up leading the AFC South. So this is a very, very important game for both teams. So I'm looking for this to be kind of like a playoff game in that sense. And I think both of these teams have good enough offenses and weak enough defenses to support a shootout. And therefore, I think A.J. Brown is a must play this week. But our start of the week is Robert Woods. He plays Dallas, who they've actually been decent on the season. They're number 25 in fantasy points allowed to the wide receivers, but they're number 8 in fantasy points allowed in the last 5 weeks. We kind of talked about this in our quarterback start sits when we were talking Jared Goff, that Dallas has actually been much worse on defense in the last 5 weeks than they have been on the entire season. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the last couple weeks they've had a much tougher schedule. Well, their schedule doesn't get any easier playing the Rams, who have been red hot over the past couple weeks. They're really looking more like their 2018 selves. Robert Woods, back-to-back 100-yard games. I look for him to continue that trend. Again, with Dallas's defense being on the decline, and the fact that this game is looking to also be a shootout this week. Right now, I believe the over-under for this game is at about 48-49. Considering that, it's very likely that this turns into a high-scoring game. Robert Woods finally got his touchdown drought broken last week. I look for that trend to continue into this week. I love Robert Woods this week. If you have him, you must start him. Okay, looking at the sits this week, players that I'm trying to make sure are on my bench if I don't have a better option. We'll start with Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs is playing the Chargers this week. The Chargers are 30th in fantasy points allowed to the wide receivers, and they're actually 32nd over the course of the last 5 weeks. I don't predict this to be a very high-scoring game. I think that the Vikings and Chargers, this would be more of a defensive battle. I think the Vikings win this one pretty decisively, and I don't think they're going to have to do a lot on offense. We also have Adam Thielen looking like he's finally going to come back this week, so that'll also eat into Diggs' potential targets. So if Diggs ends up, he's one of those players that is hard to bench, because if he ends up having a really big touchdown, you're going to feel really dumb for benching him. But he's been so inconsistent week to week. At this point, I would say it's much more likely that he has a down game against the Chargers, who have only allowed 2 top 12 weeks against the wide receiver all year, than it would be for him to have a blow-up game. If you don't have a better option, obviously you're going to start players like Diggs because of their ceiling, but I think his floor is really low this week, and if you can avoid taking that risk, I would move off of him. Okay, let's look at Courtland Sutton. Very similar analysis here to Stefon Diggs. He's playing a really tough defense. Kansas City is actually very good against the wide receiver. They are 31 in fantasy points allowed all season to the wide receiver, and they haven't really gotten much worse as the season has gone on. They've been more of a run funnel type defense where they let you run the ball on them, but they don't allow you to beat them deep. And Sutton is... We're dealing with a small sample size. Let's say that with Drew Lock, we have 2 games with Drew Lock. The first game, he only threw to Sutton, and then the second game, he barely threw to Sutton. So at this point, we don't really know what the game plan is going to be with Drew Lock in this game. If we just look at where Kansas City is good, they're good against the receiver, they're poor against the running back, and they're poor against the tight end. So if logic follows, it would look like this is going to be a Lindsey and a Fant type game, in a game where Courtland Sutton could disappoint. He's not a must bench because there still is that wild card upside of we don't know what Drew Lock is going to do. But if you have a better option, I do think benching Courtland Sutton is a wise strategy. Okay, next, we're just basically going through all these players that typically have a pretty high ceiling and just have a really low floor. That seems to be the trend this week because they're all facing bad matchups. John Brown playing the Pittsburgh Steelers. Pittsburgh Steelers are number 29 in fantasy points allowed to the wide receivers all year. We've really had 2 down weeks in a row from Brown. It doesn't look like it because 2 weeks ago, Brown had that nice trick touchdown where he threw a touchdown pass to Devin Singletary. But without that, Brown would have been under 7 fantasy points in PPR for the last 2 weeks. playing against good defenses, and Pittsburgh is a really good defense. So yes, John Brown is the same thing as like Stefon Diggs. He could break a big touchdown and make you look stupid, but his floor has been so low these past couple weeks. If you have a better option, or if you have someone like an A.J. Brown who has an even higher ceiling, I don't see why I would be starting John Brown over those types of players, because his floor is so low this week. He could really tank your chances at making the fantasy Super Bowl. All right. Continue with the trend of big play receivers. Let's look at Robby Anderson, who plays the Baltimore Ravens on Thursday night. The Ravens are number 18 in fantasy points allowed to the receivers, but they've gotten better over the last 5 weeks. They're actually at number 22. This game actually has one of the lowest over-unders in Vegas this week, so it's going to likely be lower scoring than most people might anticipate. I don't think the Ravens actually blow the Jets out in this one, but I think they still win it handily. I just don't think that there's going to be a lot of scoring altogether in this game. And considering that the Ravens don't get beat deep, and that's where Anderson's game is. So if Marcus Peters is shadowing Anderson all game, there's not going to be very much chance for Anderson to go off. It's not that he won't ever get any targets, but his floor is incredibly low, and I think that the likelihood of him hitting his floor is very high. So if you have Robby Anderson, you probably have another receiver that you can start over him with a better matchup. I would look to pivot off. Okay, and then very last one, let's talk Tyler Boyd. He plays the New England Patriots. New England has basically been a team that you've been avoiding playing the offensive players around them each week. Last week, we recommended benching Tyreek Hill. He only put up 13 points in PPR, which is okay. But for a player of Tyreek Hill's caliber to be shut down to 13 points, we can only expect what they're going to end up doing to Tyler Boyd. New England has lost 2 games in a row. They're pissed, and I don't really know if Cincinnati is going to be able to do much of anything. But if I have Tyler Boyd, I'm very scared to start him against New England this week, so I'm looking to pivot off. Anyway, I really hope that this helps you guys. Again, I know this time of the year can be very stressful for a lot of people. There's a lot of things going on, or maybe you just see a lot of things going on around you and you wish that you were involved with them. Like, there's so many different things that can happen in the holiday season. There's a lot of good things about it, but there's a lot of negatives too. And one thing I don't want is for fantasy to become a negative. I'm really trying to do the best that I can to help you guys make informed decisions, and then also give you someone to blame if we make a bad choice together. Then you don't have to feel so bad at yourself. You can get mad at me. So I hope this helped you guys, and if you do like this, please feel free to like this video, subscribe for more content this season and into the next one. We'll be posting throughout the rest of the year, and we'll start strong next year in the off season. So hope you guys enjoyed this, and we will see you in the next one.